Hey guys, here we are at chapter 31, all about fungi, or fungi, depending on who you ask. This will be the third of the four kingdoms that we're going to discuss under the domain Eukarya. We've already discussed the protists, which are not really a kingdom anymore. We're just going to continue to use that kingdom protist kind of as a catch-all until we get all that sorted out. And then we've talked about the plants, the plantae or plantae, that particular domain, or that particular kingdom, I'm sorry, under the domain Eukarya. Now we're moving on to the fungi, or the fungi, and then of course we'll hit the animals, Animalia, and that'll be next. So we're going to wrap up things after the plants with the fungus, or the fungi, chapter 31. This chapter talks about and calls them the mighty mushrooms. Of course, when you think about fungi, most people think about mushrooms, but there are all different sorts of fungi, and we're going to talk about a few of those in this chapter. Fungi are very diverse and widespread. They're a pretty amazing group of living creatures, much like some of the other creatures that we've already studied that don't get a lot of press. You know, they're not well known by most of your run-of-the-mill people, but it's an amazing thing to study, and you can spend an entire semester. As a matter of fact, you can spend part of your entire professional career studying just this particular group of living creatures. They are certainly essential for the well-being of most terrestrial ecosystems because fungi break down organic matter and recycle vital nutrients. Without them, all the organic matter and nutrients that get tied up in the bodies of living creatures would never be able to return to the earth and be recycled again. About 100,000 species of fungi have been described and classified, but scientists feel that there are actually more like 1.5 million different species of fungi. There's just far more that we have yet to classify and study, as well as just the few that we have. Almost everyone's familiar with fungi in some form or another, as molds or as mushrooms like you see here. And then when you walk through a forest, like in your textbook, they talk about a particular forest in, let's see, it says Eastern Oregon. And you walk through this forest in Eastern Oregon, and there's all these beautiful tall pine trees and all sorts of hardwood trees and all these different plants. And you'll probably notice a few mushrooms down along the bottoms underneath the trees or in the kind of moist and damp areas. And the question is, can you spot the largest organism in this forest? And of course you would likely pick one of the large trees, but you would be wrong. The mighty mushrooms of this forest, if you hike through this Malheur National Forest in Eastern Oregon and you see a few of these honey mushrooms, you might not realize that these mushrooms that you think are separate individual creatures are actually all connected underneath the ground. If you were to go underneath the ground, there's a subterranean network of filaments that spread throughout 965 hectares of the forest. That's more area than 1,800 football fields. Based on its current growth rate, scientists estimate that this fungus, which is actually one living creature all connected together underneath the soil, weighs hundreds of tons and has been growing for more than 1,900 years. So if you were to look at, particularly by surface area, the largest creature in this forest, it would be the mushrooms, or actually it would be the fungus underneath the soil that you can't see. The portion that you're looking at here in this picture, the mushrooms, are just part of the reproductive system of that particular creature. So let's start here with concept 31.1. It says fungi are heterotrophs that feed by absorption. Despite their diversity, fungi share key traits and, most importantly, the way in which they derive their nutrition. You're probably thinking that a mushroom or a fungi is more closely related to a plant than to a dog or a whale or a human, but you'd really be wrong. Fungi are heterotrophs. They can't create their own food. They have to ingest their food in some way, and they're actually more closely related to you and I than they are to an oak tree. So they do not, of course, eat the way we do. They don't have a mouth. They don't ingest food particles the way we do, but they do get their nutrition from the environment around them. They're heterotrophs, and they absorb nutrients from outside of their body. They use enzymes, in some cases pretty powerful enzymes, to break down a large variety of complex molecules into smaller organic compounds that they then absorb into their cells. The versatility of these enzymes that they use contributes to their ecological success. You can find fungi almost everywhere in a variety of habits around the world. And again, while we have studied about 100,000 species, it's estimated that there's well over 1 million different species around the world. Fungi as a group of creatures exhibit some diverse lifestyles. They pretty much fall into three major categories. The first one's one you're probably most familiar with. Fungi are decomposers. They break down the bodies of dead creatures. They extract nutrients from those dead plants and animals, and they break down larger molecules into smaller ones, thereby making those nutrients, making those elements available for recycling again. We also have a lot of fungi that are parasites that are extracting nutrients from living hosts. Some of these are pathogenic. They are disease causing. We'll talk about a few of those. And then we also have fungi that are mutualists. They are parasitic in a way in that they're extracting nutrients from a living host, but they're not doing damage, or they are reciprocating in some way with actions that benefit the host. So either decomposers, parasites, or mutualists, those three categories are generally where the fungi are going to fall. As far as the physical body structure of the fungi, there's two common body structures. The most common body structures are multicellular filaments. So we call these, you'll find out, hyphae or hyphae, and those will be strands of material usually below the soil level. Also, we find them as single-celled yeasts like you see here. Some species grow as either filaments or yeasts, kind of depending upon the environmental conditions. They can kind of change between the two. Some are always filaments, a few are always yeast, and then there are some that can kind of vary between their body structures depending on the conditions. If you're watching the PowerPoint, right click and hit play on this animation. This is a really good kind of a short summary overview of fungal reproduction and nutrition. So if you want to start anywhere with a brief overview, this would be a good place to start. If you're not watching the PowerPoint, this should be a Shockwave file underneath the notes folder for Chapter 31. The morphology of the multicellular fungi, which the vast majority of them are multicellular. There are some unicellular, but many of them are multicellular. The vast majority of them, their morphology is very much evolved or built to absorb nutrients. It enhances their ability to absorb nutrients. Fungi consist of mycelia, which is a network of branched hyphae adapted for absorption. These hyphae are going to be like threads or very thin pieces of tissue that spread far and wide throughout the soil or throughout the material that they are living off of, say a decaying log or something like that. And the mycelium structure helps maximize its surface to volume ratio. So you have these creatures that don't become, for the most part, their bodies don't become very large in size. They're very thin and spread out in this very net-like structure. Fungal walls contain chitin as opposed to, say, a plant cell wall that contains cellulose. Fungal cell walls contain chitin, which is the same nitrogen-containing polysaccharide that insects use to build their exoskeleton. So when you look at the tough outer shell of a beetle, that's also made of chitin. That's the same material in the cell walls of the fungi. Here's a good illustration kind of showing all of these things. The mushrooms that we see above the ground are actually just the reproductive structures of the fungi, and it's made up of what we call hyphae. And hyphae is a conglomeration of these thin little strands called mycelium. So the spore-producing structures we're going to find out are in the mushroom. That's kind of a reproductive portion of the creature. And then the majority of the creature is usually below the soil or, say for example, within the rotting log or on top of the rotting log. Here is the mycelium covering some rotting plant material. And you kind of zoom in and see the thread-like structure. Lots of surface area for absorbing nutrients either from the soil or from the decaying organic matter that it's on. Most fungi have hyphae that are divided into cells by cross walls called septa. These septa are not complete cuts all the way through, though. You'll have this division, but the septa contain these large pores that allow cytoplasm and organelles to move between the cells. So they are separated cells, but there's large openings between them, so they kind of share some materials and share, say, mitochondria or other organelles. So we have another kind of fungi called cynocytic. Cynocytic lack the septa and have a continuous cytoplasmic mass with hundreds or thousands of nuclei. So here we don't have those divisions, we don't have those cross walls. We do have, it would seem like multiple cells, but they're not subdivided by cell walls and by divisions of septa. So they have multiple nuclei within this one basically giant, large cell, maybe hundreds or thousands of nuclei. This will be very similar to the plasmodial slime molds that we talked about in Chapter 28, which, if you'll remember, we mentioned that the plasmodial slime molds used to be thought of as fungi until we did further genetic testing and were able to look at that at a molecular level. So we have two different types of fungi. Some of them are separated with septa. They have hyphae that are divided into cells, and then we have another kind called synocytic, or this is a hard word to pronounce, synocytic fungi that lack the septa that separate the two. So here we have an illustration of the two. The ones that are separated by the septum, that would be the singular septum or the septa, they are called septate hyphae, and they are separated cells, but you'll notice it's not a complete separation. There's a big opening in between the cells, and they can share material through them. So this would be the septate hyphae. And then we have the synocytic hyphae that do not have those separations, do not have the septa that separate the what would be separate cells. So you basically have what looks like one giant cell with multiple nuclei. So septate hyphae and synocytic hyphae. We're going to see some of the fungi have unique and specialized hyphae called haustoria. Haustoria is kind of a specialized type of hyphae that's used to work its way into or penetrate the tissue of plants or other hosts to extract or exchange nutrients. So these haustoria are kind of like the arms or needles of the hyphae of the fungi that work their way into other creatures, a living plant, in some cases perhaps even another living animal. And then there are some unique different types of fungi that have very fascinating hyphae, kind of like little lassos that can actually be used to capture live prey. You can actually watch video clips of this happening. So here in this illustration we have the fungal hyphae, or the fungal hyphae, and then here is the haustorium, which is kind of like its little arm that it uses to reach into the cells of this particular plant. So this is a specialized type of hyphae. And then we have on the next slide, here is a hyphae that is very specialized in the form of loops, and we have these tiny little soil worm-like creatures called nematodes. And they're not the size of an earthworm, we're talking smaller than that, but these tiny little nematodes will wiggle their way through the soil, and they will either be drawn to or accidentally find themselves wriggling through one of these little lassos, and suddenly the fungi will tighten that little lasso, and then the hyphae will wrap around the nematode and begin to use some of that hyphae that interjects itself or injects itself that we talked about, the haustoria here, the haustorium, and it will begin to take nutrients from this nematode. It will begin to absorb nutrients from this little creature that it has caught in its little lasso. Another form of fungal hyphae that are very important that we're going to find out, especially to other land plants and even to human agriculture, is called mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza are mutually beneficial relationships that occur between fungi and plant roots, and such relationships have been around for millions of years. As a matter of fact, scientists seem to indicate that the evidence shows that these relationships occurred early on when land plants began to occur and come from the waters onto the land, that there were mycorrhizal relationships very early in that history. We have two different types of mycorrhiza. One of them is called ectomycorrhiza fungi, and ectomycorrhiza fungi basically just wrap around the outside portion of the plant. They form like a covering or sheath of hyphae over the root, and they will also grow into the spaces in between the root cells, but they don't necessarily actually go into the root cells. They go into the root and they grow in between the spaces of the cell, and they wrap around the outside of the root. That would be the ectomycorrhizal fungi. The second type is called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Arbuscular actually extends hyphae into the cell, through the cell walls, into the root cells, or into these various tubes that they form by pushing in openings of the root cell membrane. So ectomycorrhizal are kind of on the outside and around the cells, and arbuscular actually work their way into the cells themselves. So it doesn't sound very pleasant for the plant, so why would this be considered a mutualistic relationship? Well, the mycorrhizal fungi help the plant absorb nutrients. Remember, these hyphae, these mycelium, are very thin and they are very good at absorbing nutrients from the soil. So the mycorrhizal fungi help deliver phosphate ions and other minerals to the plant in a far more efficient fashion than the plant roots can do by themselves. And it's mainly because of the high surface area ratio of these hyphae, of these mycelium that we're talking about. As a matter of fact, most vascular plants have mycorrhiza. Most vascular plants have some sort of relationship with fungi, and they are important to plant growth and development. It's rare to actually find plants that do not have this relationship with fungi. So we're going to stop right there for a moment. That's just kind of an overview. It's interesting to think that these living creatures that you wouldn't think of as being more closely related to animals and plants, but they are. They have chitin as part of their cell walls. They are heterotrophic. They don't make their own food. Certainly they don't eat the way we do, but they absorb nutrients from their environment. They have these sometimes mutually beneficial relationships with other plants and animals, and they're certainly important as decomposers, breaking down and recycling nutrients. So that's a good introduction. We'll stop right there. We'll move on to Concept 31.2, talk a little bit about their life cycle and how they reproduce. We'll take a break. Be right back.